So I saw a very funny statistic yesterday while I was at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and LA Rams game, which was freaking phenomenal, by the way. I think I have it on my archives on my Instagram story if you want to check it out. I wanted to vlog it, but I also wanted to enjoy the game in the future. Maybe if I have a cameraman that lives in LA, I'll pay for their ticket and they could come in and they could vlog me. And if you're a camera person and you're interested in that, hit me up on my Twitter. I made a new Twitter, by the way. I just felt like it was appropriate. A lot of times people would get a little annoyed that I was doing NBA tweets and NFL tweets. So I made a separate Twitter called Mikerophone NFL just to tweet about NFL stuff. So if you want to check that out, a link is going to be in the description down below. We also made a separate TikTok just for NFL content, kind of like how I separated my channels on YouTube. I figured I'd do the same thing for you guys on TikTok and Twitter, but my Instagram is just going to be at the Flight Mike if you want to follow me there. Now this intro is getting way too long, so drop a like, consider subscribing and turning on our notifications. And now that we get all that out of the way, break! Mic check 1 2 1 2. What's going on, everybody? I saw a very comical statistic while I was at the Rams versus Buccaneers game, and that was the fact that Mitchell Trubisky had the same amount of net passing yardage as the entire Chicago Bears offense. Mitchell Trubisky went 1 for 1 for the Buffalo Bills this past week for 1 yard, and Justin Fields went 6 for 20 for 1 passing yard as well. And this entire situation literally brought me back to another situation that was directly, well, not directly identical, but very similar to this, where there was a head coach involved, there was a promising rookie draft pick involved, and he was just thrown into the fire with very little or no preparation and with a horrible game plan in play. The guy I'm referring to is Dwayne Haskins. His debut was against the New York Giants. He was thrown in the middle of the game because Jay Gruden needed some way to save his job, and he was like, hey, let's take this underdeveloped rookie and just throw him into the fire and maybe he could do something. And Dwayne Haskins had a very similar type of game. He threw 3 interceptions, he had 6.3 yards per attempt, he completed just over 50% of his passes, and it was just not a good day for him at all whatsoever. And obviously because he was just thrown into the fire before he really got accustomed to the NFL. He was thrown in during week 4 and Jay Gruden would get fired shortly after. But I got a very similar type of vibe from this past week when Matt Nagy and the Chicago Bears went up against the Cleveland Browns. Now, we have to give the Cleveland Browns their due diligence because I think a lot of people just pay attention to the Baker Mayfield, Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt and Odell Beckham Jr. offense. But a lot of people don't take a step back and realize that the reason why the Cleveland Browns are so freaking good is on top of the remarkable rushing attack that Kevin Stefanski has integrated into that offense is a tremendously remarkable defense that is terrifying on paper and even more terrifying when they did the stuff that they did this past Sunday. Like, every player I'm about to list for you is either a player that at some point in their career was a tremendously good player. Like, for example, Myles Garrett, former number 1 overall pick. Takk McKinley was a first-round pick that didn't fulfill his potential in Atlanta. Malik Jackson, former anchor of the Jacksonville Jaguars defensive line and the Denver Broncos defensive line during their Super Bowl runs. Jadeveon Clowney, another former number 1 overall pick. Malcolm Smith, a former Super Bowl MVP. Denzel Ward, a former top 5 first-round pick. Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, a player that should have been drafted in the first round but was drafted later on in the draft in the second round this year. John Johnson, who was probably my favorite pickup from the Cleveland Browns this past year. You get what I'm saying. The Chicago Bears didn't really go up against a horrible defense. They went up against one of the top defenses in the NFL, which is why I was upset that Justin Fields was the starting QB to begin with. I mean, originally, according to Matt Nagy, the plan was for Justin Fields to make his debut against the lowly Detroit Lions. And this is nothing against the Detroit Lions because honestly, even though they're rebuilding, whenever I watch them play, I don't watch an incompetent football team. I just watch a team that doesn't really have the talent yet to compete, but they're competitive as hell, and I'll give that to them. They're nothing nothing like the New York Jets, they're nothing like the Jacksonville Jaguars, they're nothing like the 0-16 Cleveland Browns of the past, which makes them a remarkable team for Justin Fields to debut against. But unfortunately, Andy Dalton went down with a bone bruise, and instead of Nick Foles being elevated to take on this team that could potentially scar him for life, Justin Fields was placed in. Okay, well, Matt Nagy is hailed as this offensive genius. He's hailed as a head coach that comes from the Andy Reid coaching tree. Clearly, he will probably have some sort of game plan to make sure Justin Fields won't get destroyed. No, there was a lot of 5-man protection. There was some 6-man chip protection, but for the most part, Justin Fields in the first half was 3 of 4 for 29 yards, had 1 rush for 7 yards, and was sacked 4 times for negative 21 yards. In the entire game, Justin Fields was sacked 9 times, which was tied for the most by a Bears quarterback since the merger. Now, if you remember, originally the reason why Matt Nagy came to the Chicago Bears, bear in mind Ryan Pace was in New Orleans when Drew Brees was signed, and I guess he saw a lot of Drew Brees and Mitchell Trubisky, which shocks me because they're 2 completely different types of quarterbacks. I mean, one's more mobile than the other, one has better accuracy than the other. It's just, the comparison is just not there. But Matt Nagy came to the Chicago Bears, and for the first year, it seemed like Mitchell Trubisky actually looked like the real deal. But as time progressed forward, it seemed like Trubisky was struggling with making basic reads, and the Chicago Bears were doing things like, taking him out and then bringing in Nick Foles instead, or benching him and then bringing him back in. And stuff like this really messes with the psyche of a first-round pick, especially a former number 2 overall pick. And eventually, the Chicago Bears got the idea that, hey, Mitchell Trubisky is the problem here, it's not Matt Nagy. But to be honest, typically in these scenarios, I would like to point the blame finger at the head coach that failed to create an offensive system that really maximized the skill set of his quarterbacks. And to be honest, I think that was really on display over this past weekend, where you saw probably his best opportunity to keep his job, Justin Fields, getting massacred out there. There was no confidence being built whatsoever. They had no game plan whatsoever. It really, it kind of reminded me of last year when the Denver Broncos ran out of quarterbacks, so they had to put in Kendall Hinton, who technically is a wide receiver but was an emergency QB. It kind of reminded me of that, although don't get me wrong, Justin Fields is a more capable quarterback, but the offense just looked like they had no idea what they're doing. And this is an offense that, bear in mind, has Allen Robinson, has David Montgomery, has Cole Kmet, has very solid pieces. The issue appears to be the offensive line. So if the issue is the offensive line, then that's even more reason not to put Justin Fields in this year. But then there comes the issue of, hey, if the Chicago Bears don't at least improve somewhat this year, then Ryan Pace and Matt Nagy might be out. And they went into this season with a fairly terrible offensive line. And I guess in some weeks you could get away with that, but when you're going up against Malik Jackson, Myles Garrett, Jadeveon Clowney, I don't think you could get away with that anymore. Things are so bad that you have all of NFL Twitter apologizing to Mitchell Trubisky for thinking that he was the problem for the Chicago Bears. But currently, it looks like they're about to repeat the same mistakes over here. My issue with this situation isn't the fact that the Chicago Bears are a bad organization. It isn't the fact that Justin Fields isn't capable enough. It's the fact that Matt Nagy literally went into a game against the league's best defense and seemed to have had no plan at all whatsoever. And this is why Justin Fields is in a very bad situation. And I don't know if he's in a worse situation than Trevor Lawrence is, because his head coach clearly and his front office clearly doesn't seem to know what they're doing. I don't know if he's in a worse situation than Zach Wilson's in, because his team just seems to be fairly devoid of talent. I don't know. I definitely want to say Mac Jones is probably in the best situation out of all of these QBs, or Trey Lance is in the best situation out of all these QBs, where he's actually being sit down, he's developing. Kyle Shanahan puts him in some games so he could really get his feet wet. He's allowing him to score some touchdowns so he could build some confidence and get a taste of what the NFL is like. But in Justin Fields' situation, you literally threw him in his first game and he got sacked 9 times. And this is literally your saving grace. If this fails, Matt Nagy is out. If this fails, Ryan Pace is probably out too. Now, I'm not going to completely say Justin Fields is doomed up until this next game against the Detroit Lions. And if the Detroit Lions beat the Chicago Bears, that's when I'm going to start saying things like Matt Nagy needs to be fired, Ryan Pace needs to be fired, Justin Fields needs to be benched, because this is not an environment where you develop and cultivate a potential game-changing quarterback that could easily be the best quarterback in Chicago Bears history. The worst part is that Justin Fields has such a versatile skill set. He's able to scramble, he's able to run zone reads with David Montgomery that would keep the defense on their toes. After watching the film, I didn't see any sort of versatility that was similar to that. So I really hope that something happens, at the very least, bench Justin Fields for the rest of the season if you want to keep Matt Nagy, because if you potentially traumatize this talent, a player that I believe would have been the number 1 overall pick in the 2022 NFL draft, should he have stayed an extra year at Ohio State, then not only are Matt Nagy and Ryan Pace doomed, but it's going to be very tough to imagine getting another opportunity at a quarterback as good as Justin Fields within the next couple of years. Let me know in the comment section down below what you guys think about all this. Aside from that, I'm your boy Mike, and I'm dropping our mic until our next upload.